one of the greatest challenges New Hampshire faces is dealing with what I call the cloud of Claremont that has overshadowed our educational enterprise in New Hampshire for the last almost 20 years. And in the flyer that I've made available to you, that's black and white, on the back of it I've set out two things. One is the section of the Constitution which has been the focal point of that Claremont cloud, and then the constitutional amendment that was passed by the New Hampshire State Senate with Governor Lynch's support. Beginning with Part 2, Article 83, let me just, by way of context, say that our New Hampshire Constitution is really a very well-written document in a number of ways. But there are only a few places you'll find in the New Hampshire Constitution where there's actually an affirmative mandate by the people to the state government, to do something affirmatively. And Part 2, Article 83 is where you find the education mandate. And that is that the state is responsible for education. And I put in bold there, and it's really beautiful language. So let me read it so we can all start on the same page. Part 2, Article 83 in relevant part says, knowledge and learning generally diffused through a community being essential to the preservation of a free government and spreading the opportunities and advantages of education through the various parts of the country, being highly conducive to promote this end. It shall be the duty of the legislators and magistrates in all future periods of this government to cherish the interests of literature and the sciences in all seminaries and public schools, to encourage private and public institutions, rewards, and immunities for the promotion of agriculture, arts, sciences, commerce, trades, manufactures, and natural history of the country, to countenance and inculcate the principles of humanity and general benevolence, public and private charity, industry and economy, honesty and punctuality, sincerity, sobriety, and all social affections and general sentiments among the people. Beautiful language, isn't it? And this language is taken by, largely because of, or inspired by John Adams, who had a similar provision in the Massachusetts Constitution. I want to share with you a very important principle, a legal doctrine or legal paradigm, if you will, about New Hampshire. A lot of us believe in local control, and I think probably in this room most people believe in local control. I certainly do. But local control in New Hampshire is not like it is in some other states. We do not have home rule in New Hampshire. We are a state where our Constitution provides essentially a top-down structure. And I say that to you because the New Hampshire constitutions have been interpreted over the years as providing that the state must, the state itself as the state through the legislature, is the source of any authority that exists at the town or city level or school districts. The political subdivisions of the state are created by the state, and then they're invested with powers that are delegated by the state. So in a sense, it's truly a top-down model. Now, that's a foreign concept to those of us who believe in local control, because I think most New Hampshireites think, well, the cities and towns are organized because the people in the cities and towns said, this is our geography here, these are our boundaries, this is what we want to do here. That is not the case in New Hampshire. We are a top-down system. And that's an important concept because there's some in the conservative movement who oppose what I'm going to be talking about here, and that's the amendment. So, recognizing that the Constitution provides an affirmative duty on the state to, what I would submit to you, provide education to our children. How does our state do it? It does it by creating political subdivisions like school districts, where they're given authority to set and develop curriculum, hire teachers, build schools, and those schools and the expense of education is actually paid for by cities and towns who are part of the school district, again by delegation of tax authority from the state to the cities and towns, and that's the local property tax. Cities and towns do not have an inherent power to tax. That power comes by delegation of authority from the state to the cities and towns. And again, there are a number of Supreme Court cases I'd be happy to cite to you that provide exactly that. So, until 1993, the first Claremont case, the Supreme Court said this in response to a challenge to the constitutionality of our delivery system, our educational delivery system. The Supreme Court said, This Part 2, Article 83 provides an affirmative duty to the state, on the part of the state, to provide an adequate education to all educable children and to guarantee adequate funding. I was chairman of the State Board of Education, and one of the real benefits and perks of being chairman of the State Board, a completely volunteer job, is I was named as a defendant in that lawsuit. And I can assure you as a lawyer, even though I know how to bring lawsuits and defend them, being named in the lawsuit isn't fun, okay? But I was named as the chairman of the State Board of Education as a defendant in that case. And I worked with the Attorney General's office from 1993 until we had an actual trial in 1996, preparing our case in the Superior Court. After that declaration of the first Claremont case, the plaintiffs went forward in a trial. I was a witness in a trial. I was actually an expert witness describing the educational system we had here in New Hampshire. And I said a couple things. First of all, the state has defined an adequate education, which we did, and we actually reiterated it through our minimum standards and the structure we have. And secondly, I said the state provides adequate funding because it's delegated to the cities and towns the power of local property taxes. So, in the end of 1996, early 1997, Judge Manius, who was the Superior Court judge in Merrimack County, issued a 160-page opinion. And you know what he found? He found, yes, you are constitutional. This system works. The state has defined an adequate education, it's provided the superstructure, if you will, to create the delivery system to school districts with the participation of local communities, and the state has provided the power, the taxing authority to the local communities to support education, and in addition to that, it has a mechanism called the Augenblick formula, really a formula that was developed under the leadership of Governor Sununu in the 80s that provided for targeted aid. It took lottery money and a few other dollars that were contributed by the state, and it provided a mechanism for distributing that money on the basis of fiscal capacity of the cities and towns. So, if you're in a school district with 3 towns in it, 2 of the towns are deemed to have an average fiscal capacity based on property tax, assessed values, and income of that community to provide that adequate education support, but the 3rd town doesn't have the fiscal capacity. The Augenblick formula provided money to the 3rd town for property tax relief or support, but not to the other 2 towns. It was a system, as imperfect as it is, that was working. That's what the Superior Court decided. What does the Supreme Court do on appeal? Claremont 2, it basically says this: thank you very much for your 160-page opinion, Judge Manius. You didn't understand, but apparently the parties didn't understand what we really meant in Claremont 1. And the court essentially ignores that work product and says, all right, Claremont 1, we articulated the duties of providing adequate education and guaranteeing adequate funding. What we also are saying is that that duty is a fundamental right of the people, subject to strict scrutiny, which means, for purposes of standard of review, that the court can substitute its judgment for that of the legislature. If you evaluate a challenge to the Constitution based, or a legislative enactment based on a rational basis standard or rational basis test, which is a more normal way of looking at a challenge to the constitutionality of a legislative enactment, the presumption is what the legislature has done is constitutional. In a strict scrutiny analysis, there's no presumption of constitutionality. And then what does the court say? The court says, the duty to provide an education in Part 2, Article 83 is not delegable. This is not delegable. And it doesn't say exactly in those 2 words, but essentially that's what the decision says. And what does it mean? It means that for purposes of taxing, and now we're going to go to a second part of the Constitution, which I didn't copy here, but it's Part 2, Article 5. Part 2, Article 5 deals with the general powers of the legislature, including the tax power, and it says in Article 5, any taxes assessed in New Hampshire have to be reasonable and proportional across and uniform across the taxing district. Now, up until Claremont 2, the taxing district to support education was what? The city or town. You look across Manchester or Rye or Keene, and you say, is the property tax assessed in that community reasonable, proportional, and uniform across that taxing district? Well, the court says because we hold that the duty of education is non-delegable, The taxing district, if you're going to use a property tax, is the state of New Hampshire, the entire state. And so you can't have disparate tax, assessed values and all to support education. And what does that mean? That meant that the court wanted us to have a broad-based tax for education, which runs completely opposite of what we had been doing for almost 200 years in education in New Hampshire. And it destroys local control. If you take away the power of the purse from the local people and shift it over to the state, which is what the Supreme Court held in Claremont too, then you have the state making decisions about who gets what money and how much money. And then you started having, after Claremont too, a whole donor town and recipient towns, and again the state controlling the collection and distribution of the statewide property tax, which is what the legislature ended up enacting. When I was in 1997, after the Claremont 2 decision was handed down, I met with Governor Shaheen, who had come up with what was called at that time her ABC plan. And I said to her, that plan is unconstitutional because you're trying to target aid, and the court is never going to uphold that. She said, and I said, so do your ABC plan with a constitutional amendment. She said to me, through Judy Reardon, we can't support a constitutional amendment. It's not politically viable for us. I said, you need to support a constitutional amendment because they're going to find it unconstitutional. She said, I think you're wrong. ABC plan gets sent up to the Supreme Court, unconstitutional, because it targets aid and it doesn't apply what the court wants, and that's a statewide approach to education. I believe in local control. I think you do. I want to create and get a constitutional amendment that gets us out of the Claremont cloud. There's been some very interesting economic analysis too about the state of New Hampshire. Our taxes, our tax burden, and our economic productivity, actually, our economic productivity has been flat almost since the Claremont cases. And largely because I think there's been a negative effect on the tax structure we now have, which is arcane in that it is a statewide property tax, where the state actually makes the decision about how much taxes to raise and how to distribute it. But more importantly, it's broken the causal relationship between true spending decisions at the local level on education and the tax implications of those decisions. And you know this in Rye and any other town in the state where you meet for town meeting. And you talk about building a new school, adding an addition, hiring new staff. How much is this going to mean to me on my taxes? And people will say, if we adopt this, it's going to be $1 per thousand on my property taxes, or 50 cents, or $2. And you make a decision based on a cost-benefit analysis. A statewide property tax or any broad-based tax removes that decision. It removes the causal connection between spending and taxation. That's the magic of New Hampshire's local control that we've created, yes, admittedly top-down. So, I hope it's not too early for this kind of dissertation.
No, keep going.
I'm excited about it and passionate about it. I'm very passionate about it. But I think we're there to have a fix. This is the first time since 1993 that there seems to be a consensus that's been formed by a Democratic governor and most, I believe, the legislature. And CACR 12 at the bottom of the sheet is the amendment that we're proposing, or at least that I'm supporting. It's not perfect. It's not the way I would write it if I wrote it myself, but it's something I can support, and I think it gets us where we need to be in New Hampshire. So it says, Part 2, Article 5C, that's the provision. Rather than amend or try to purport to amend Part 2, Article 83, the education provision, what Part 2, Article 5C does is to amend that portion of the Constitution that deals with taxation. And it says here that in the fulfillment of the provisions with respect to education set forth in Part 2, Article 83, so we're acknowledging that there is an education responsibility in that section of the Constitution. The legislature, and this is important, the legislature as one of the branches of government, not the court. So the first objective is to get the court out of this business of micromanaging and overseeing education. The legislature shall have full power and authority and the responsibility to define reasonable standards for elementary and secondary public education, to establish reasonable standards of accountability, and to mitigate local disparities in educational opportunity and fiscal capacity. So, what we're saying here in this provision, it's the legislature that decides to set the superstructure, which we've done historically anyways. The state sets minimum standards. That's what we did at the State Board of Education. It sets graduation requirements. if anyone wants to get a New Hampshire diploma, don't you think the state has a vested interest in knowing what that means? Whether you're homeschooled, went to private school, non-public school, or public school, you want to know, as citizens and taxpayers and parents, that if a child has a diploma, it means more than seat time. It's supposed to mean competence in reading, writing, math, civics. Are we there yet? Not exactly, but that's the objective, right? So the state has an interest in making sure there are some minimum standards, and there are standards. So this acknowledges this. But it says that's the legislature's role, and the full power and authority means the legislature has the full power and authority. Again, not the court. The second sentence, and it also acknowledges what we've done historically, and that is to provide some mitigation of tax burden or tax burden for some of our communities where there's disparities and fiscal capacity, which is what we did with the Augenblick formula. The second sentence says, further, the legislature shall have full power and authority to determine the amount of and the method of raising and distributing state funding for public education. What that means is that the legislature, again, not the court, is going to be responsible for the education funding system. And I believe, and that's that sentence, what it does is it gives the legislature the ability to delegate the funding authority back to the cities and towns, which it can't do today under the existing interpretation of the New Hampshire Constitution by our court. This should be a provision that can be supported by most New Hampshire people. It doesn't deny the state's role of helping establish this educational system of ours, but it affirms the legislature's role as the primal role, not the courts, and it allows the legislature to create a true local control system. And it's a very important amendment to get passed. And Jeb Bradley endorsed me. I'm going to get a little political. Although there's a Democrat tracker here who's taking my picture, and that's okay. It's a public place, and I'm happy that because they need to be part of this too. So for the Democratic Party, please join us in this effort for CACR 12. So the point is that we have the ability to have the support of Democrats and Republicans for this very important initiative to restore local control to our schools. And I think we can get behind this amendment. Now, there's some folks in the conservative movement and some of my friends in the conservative movement and supporters who say, no, we shouldn't be doing this because we should just ignore the court. Or what this is doing is putting more power in the hands of this legislature or the state. And people who say that don't understand the system we operate within. The state, the power begins with the state. I may want it to be different, but that's not the New Hampshire system we have today. We have a system, unless we amend the Constitution and do home rule, then that would affect other things as well, more than we need to do here. We have to accept the beginning proposition that the power has to come from the state through the legislature, and that's what this acknowledges, in order to have power at the local level for local control of education, local planning and local funding. So, and this does not give more power to the state than it already has under Part 2, Article 83. The word duty appears in that section. So what this does is to push the responsibility and the authority in the legislature, the duly elected representatives of the people. It takes it away from the court, which is now sitting in judgment over what we do in New Hampshire on education. And the next lawsuit that's coming down the pike, and it'll come if we don't fix this, will again continue this cloud that we're operating under in New Hampshire when it comes to education. So most people can get behind this because it, again, reaffirms the state's rightful role, but through the legislature, and it allows for local funding, true local control over education. And that's why I support this amendment. I was saying that I was going to speak politically. Senator Bradley endorsed me last week. I've worked with Jeb for 20 years on legislative matters as well as when he was in Congress. I'm honored to have his support, but he is committed to helping pass this amendment too. And this is one of those areas where we can work together and we can bring a coalition of people who aren't necessarily Republicans or conservatives, but Democrats and independents should see the wisdom of passing this so we can get out from the Claremont cloud and put ourselves into the right path for purpose of educational quality and control. And then we can start truly reforming education in New Hampshire. And that'll have to be a subject for another day, because I'm already exhausting my allotted time, but I've got about 10 minutes to take some questions, which I'd be very happy to do about this or any other topic that's permissible in our public square here.
Grok TV.